The man who ate what the dead left behind, a forgotten ritual from history. A man enters a farmhouse where someone has just died. The body lies on a wooden table in the center of the room. On the chest of the dead person rests a piece of bread. A small wooden cup of ale stands beside it. The villagers step back as the man approaches. He takes the bread, eats it, and drinks from the cup. No one in the room stops him. In the hills along the border of Wales and Western England, during the 1600s, death usually happened inside the home. When someone died, the body was placed in the main room, while neighbors gathered for the wake. Candles burned beside the table where the body rested. People sat along the walls, speaking quietly and waiting for the burial that would take place the next day. In some villages, another small custom appeared during the wake. A piece of bread was placed on the chest of the dead. After a short time, a particular man was called to the house. He stepped forward, took the bread from the body, and ate it in front of everyone in the room. In several communities, this man had a specific name. He was called a sin eater. This is the story of the sin eaters. A world built on tradition. For most people living in the countryside of Britain during the 17th century, life was not organized by written rules or official systems. It was shaped by habit, memory, and traditions that had been repeated for generations. Villages were small and tightly connected. Families lived close to the land, surrounded by fields, animals, and neighbors they had often known since childhood. News traveled slowly. The wider world beyond the hills rarely interfered with daily life. What mattered most happened within the boundaries of the local community. Work structured the rhythm of the day. The land had to be cultivated, animals cared for, tools repaired, and food stored for the winter months. Survival depended on cooperation within the household and trust between neighboring families. But work alone did not hold these communities together. Just as important were the customs that marked the most significant moments of life. When a child was born, neighbors visited and certain rituals were followed. When a couple married, the village gathered and repeated familiar traditions that everyone understood. These customs created a sense of continuity. They linked the present generation with those who had lived before them. Death followed the same pattern. For people living in these communities, death was not distant or hidden. It was part of everyday experience. Illness, accidents, and the hardships of rural life meant that most villagers had witnessed death many times before reaching adulthood. Because of this, the community developed clear ways of responding when someone died. Families prepared the body themselves. Neighbors gathered in the house. Rituals were performed that helped guide the dead from the world of the living to whatever waited beyond it. Religion played an important role in shaping how people understood these moments. The church taught that every human soul would face judgment after death. A person's actions during life, good or sinful, would determine their fate in the afterlife. Confession, repentance, and forgiveness were therefore deeply important ideas in everyday belief. But the religious understanding of death did not exist in isolation. Alongside official church teachings were older local beliefs that had developed over centuries. These traditions were rarely written down, yet they continued to influence how people thought about the soul, the body, and the fragile moment when life ended. Many villagers believed that death was not a clean break between two worlds. Instead, it was a transition. For a short time, the dead still remained close to the living. The soul had begun its journey, but its final destination was not yet certain. During this period, the actions of the living seemed to matter deeply. Prayers were spoken, candles were lit, The body was watched over carefully, and in some places, people believed that the sins of the dead might still cling to the body itself. If those sins remained unresolved, they could threaten the peace of the soul that was trying to leave the world of the living. It was this quiet but powerful fear that led certain communities to develop unusual ways of dealing with death. Practices that did not always come from the church, but from the traditions of the village itself. Among those traditions was one that appeared only after someone had died, a simple ritual involving bread, a silent room, and a man who was called for a very particular purpose. In the next chapter, we move inside the house where one of these gatherings is about to begin. The night of the wake. When someone in the village died, the first hours that followed were rarely silent or empty. News traveled quickly between nearby farms and cottages. A neighbor might notice that work had stopped in the fields, or that a door remained open longer than usual. Sometimes a child was sent along the road to tell other families what had happened. Before long, people began making their way toward the house. They came on foot, following narrow paths that connected one small farm to the next. Some carried lanterns if darkness had already fallen. Others arrived while there was still light in the sky, stepping inside quietly as the evening settled over the village. No one needed instructions. Communities like these had long established ways of responding when death occurred. People understood their roles simply by watching what had been done many times before. Inside the house, the family had already begun preparing the body. The dead were not taken away to another building or placed under the care of strangers. Instead, the responsibility remained with the household and the neighbors who had come to help. The body was washed and wrapped in a simple linen burial cloth. This preparation was both practical and respectful. Cleaning the body helped slow the effects of death, but it also carried symbolic meaning. It marked the transition from the ordinary routines of life to the final stages of burial. Once prepared, the body was placed inside the main room of the house. In many homes, this meant laying the body on a table or a board supported by wooden stands. The same room where meals had been shared and work had been done now became the place where the community gathered to keep watch. Candles were lit nearby. Their steady light allowed visitors to see the face of the person who had died. It also served a practical purpose, keeping the room illuminated as people moved in and out throughout the evening. This gathering was known as the wake. The wake was both a social and practical event. Friends and neighbors came to offer support to the family, to sit together during the long evening hours, and to ensure that the dead were not left alone before burial. Food and drink were often shared. Bread, ale, and simple meals passed quietly between those present. Conversations were subdued, but they were not absent. People spoke about the person who had died, about the work that still needed to be done in the coming days, or about ordinary matters that filled the spaces between moments of silence. The wake could last many hours. Sometimes it continued late into the night, with visitors arriving and leaving as their own households required attention. The steady movement of people through the room created a rhythm that many villagers had experienced before. But within this familiar setting, some communities practiced a ritual that did not belong to the official ceremonies of the church. It was quiet and brief. It required no priest and no formal prayer. Instead, it involved an object so ordinary that it might have been taken directly from the family's own table, a piece of bread, placed carefully on the chest of the dead. And once it appeared there, everyone in the room understood that the next part of the ritual was about to begin. In the next chapter, we meet the man who was called to take that bread away. the man who was called. Once the bread had been placed on the chest of the dead, the atmosphere inside the room often changed in a subtle but noticeable way. The wake continued, but the gathering now carried an unspoken expectation. Someone in the house would eventually leave. This task was usually given to a younger man or a neighbor who knew the paths between the farms and cottages nearby. Without much discussion, he stepped outside and made his way into the darkness of the village. He knew exactly where he was going. Most communities that practiced this custom also knew the person who performed it. The man lived somewhere nearby, often in a small cottage or on the edge of the village itself. He was not an official member of the church. He held no formal title. But when someone died, he sometimes received a quiet request to come. The man was known as a sin eater. The name did not come from any official teaching or written rule. It grew out of the belief that the bread placed on the body had absorbed something from the person who had died, that something was believed to be the burden of the dead person's sins. In communities where this idea existed, people worried that certain sins might remain unresolved when a person died. Confession might not have been spoken in time. Apologies might never have been made. The person might have passed away suddenly, without the chance to settle their spiritual affairs. If these sins remained, many feared that they could trouble the soul as it left the world of the living. The sin eater's role was to take that burden away. When he arrived at the house, he did not enter as a guest in the same way as the others. The people gathered at the wake usually made space for him, sometimes stepping slightly aside as he approached the table. The bread was still there. He would take it from the chest of the dead and eat it. Sometimes the ritual included a small drink of ale or another simple beverage placed beside the bread. The act itself was brief and quiet, lasting only a few moments, but the meaning behind it was significant. By consuming the bread, the sin eater was believed to take the dead person's remaining sins upon himself. The burden that might have followed the soul into the afterlife was instead carried away by the man who had eaten it. When the ritual was finished, he did not usually stay long. He left the house much as he had entered it, quietly and without ceremony. The wake continued after his departure. Candles still burned. People still spoke in low voices. The burial would still take place the following day. But in the minds of those gathered there, something important had already been resolved. The soul of the dead person was now believed to be free from the sins that had once belonged to it. In the next chapter, we explore the beliefs about sin, judgment, and the afterlife that made this unusual ritual seem necessary to the communities that practiced it. Sin, judgment, and the afterlife. To understand why the ritual of the sin eater existed at all, it is necessary to look more closely at how people in these communities thought about sin and what happened after death. For many villagers in the 17th century, religion was not a distant or abstract idea. It was woven into everyday life. Church bells marked the passage of the week. Sermons spoke regularly about judgment, salvation, and the fate of the soul. People were reminded often that life on earth was temporary and that every person would eventually face an accounting for their actions. Sin was not simply a moral idea. It was understood as a real burden carried by the soul. According to Christian teaching at the time, forgiveness required repentance. A person needed to recognize their wrongdoing, seek forgiveness, and attempt to make peace with God before death arrived. But death did not always wait for these moments of reflection. Illness could spread quickly. Accidents happened in fields, forests, and workshops. A person might fall sick and die within days or even hours without the opportunity to confess their sins or speak with a priest. For families and neighbors, this possibility created a quiet but persistent fear. What would happen to the soul of someone who died without resolving these matters? Church teachings offered answers, but in rural communities, those answers sometimes blended with older traditions that had developed long before formal religious structures became firmly established. Many villagers believed that the moment immediately after death was uncertain. The soul had begun its journey away from the living world, but its path might still be influenced by what happened in the hours that followed. Prayers spoken beside the body could help guide the soul. Candles burning through the night symbolized watchfulness and protection. The presence of neighbors and family created a sense that the dead person had not been abandoned during this transition. But for some communities, another concern remained. What if the sins of the dead still lingered? In these places, the idea emerged that sin could be transferred away from the dead person through a symbolic act. Bread placed on the body was believed to absorb the weight of those remaining sins. The bread itself became a kind of vessel. When the sin eater consumed it, the burden that might have followed the soul into the afterlife was believed to pass into him instead. This idea may seem unusual today, but within the belief system of the time it followed a certain logic. If sin could weigh down a soul, then removing that weight might allow the soul to depart more freely. The sin eater did not forgive the sins. Only God could do that. Instead, he was believed to carry the remaining burden away from the dead person, so that their final journey would not be hindered by it. In the next chapter, we look more closely at the men who performed this role and how their place in the community was shaped by the ritual they carried out. The man who carried the burden. The man who performed the ritual of the sin eater rarely held a respected position within the village. In fact, his place in the community was often uneasy. Most people knew who he was and where he lived. His house might stand at the edge of the village or along a quiet road leading out toward the fields. He was not hidden, yet he was also not fully included in the ordinary social life of the community. People greeted him, but not warmly. They spoke with him when necessary, but seldom invited him to share meals or gatherings. The role he carried placed him in a strange position between usefulness and suspicion. The ritual itself was believed to help the dead, but the man who performed it was thought to carry something troubling. If the bread absorbed the sins of the deceased, and the sin eater consumed that bread, then those sins were believed to pass into him. Over time, villagers sometimes imagined that he carried the spiritual weight of many people who had died before him. Because of this belief, the sin eater was rarely treated as an ordinary neighbor. He was needed, but he was also avoided. When someone died, however, the situation changed. A messenger would walk the familiar path to his home and deliver the quiet request that his presence was required. The journey to the house of the dead was usually short, but it carried a sense of purpose that everyone understood. When he arrived at the wake, people made space for him. He approached the body, performed the ritual, and ate the bread that had been placed on the chest of the deceased. Sometimes he was also given a small drink of ale or a few coins in payment. The act itself lasted only a moment, but the meaning behind it was believed to be far greater. Once the bread had been eaten, the burden of the dead person's remaining sins was thought to have been removed. The ritual had served its purpose, and the sin eater could leave. He rarely stayed long after that. The wake returned to its quiet rhythm. Visitors continued to sit beside the body. Candles burned slowly through the evening, and preparations for the burial resumed. Meanwhile, the man who had carried out the ritual walked back along the same roads that had brought him there. His work was finished until another death occurred in the village. Over time, the position of the Sin Eater remained an unusual one within rural communities. He existed at the margins of social life, called upon only when death created a moment that seemed to require his presence. But the world around these villages was slowly changing. Religious authorities grew increasingly uncomfortable with practices that did not follow official teachings, and new attitudes toward death began to replace older customs. In the next chapter, we look at how these changes gradually brought the tradition of the Sin Eater to an end. The end of the ritual. For generations, the ritual of the Sin Eater continued quietly in certain rural communities. It was never part of official church ceremony, and it rarely appeared in written records. Instead, it survived through memory and repetition, practiced in villages where local traditions still held strong influence over daily life. But the world surrounding those villages was slowly changing. During the 17th and 18th centuries, religious leaders increasingly discouraged customs that did not align with official church teachings. Many priests viewed the practice of sin eating as a misunderstanding of how forgiveness and salvation were meant to work. According to church doctrine, the forgiveness of sins could not be transferred from one person to another through a ritual act. Confession, repentance, and prayer were considered the proper ways for a person to seek forgiveness before death. The idea that another individual could absorb those sins through bread and drink conflicted with these teachings. Because of this, many church authorities openly criticized the practice. At the same time, rural communities themselves were slowly beginning to change. Roads improved, travel became easier, and contact with larger towns increased. Ideas that had once remained isolated within small villages now spread more quickly across regions. Customs that had once felt unquestioned began to fade. Families gradually relied more on church ceremonies to guide funeral practices. Clergy took a more active role in burials, and the presence of unofficial rituals during wakes became less common. By the 19th century, the tradition of sin eating had largely disappeared from most communities. One of the last widely mentioned accounts comes from a village in Shropshire, where local memory described an elderly man who had performed the role many times during his life. According to these accounts, he would be called to a house after someone died, eat the bread placed on the body, accept a small payment, and then quietly leave. By the time these stories were written down, the practice itself was already fading into history. Today, the Sin Eater remains a curious fragment of rural folklore. It reflects a time when communities faced death closely and relied on a mixture of religious belief and local tradition to make sense of it. The ritual itself may seem unusual from a modern perspective, yet for those who practiced it, it offered a way to bring peace to a difficult moment, a small piece of bread, a quiet room, and a man whose task was to carry away what the living feared might otherwise remain behind. With time, the custom disappeared, leaving only stories that remind us how people once tried to understand the uncertain boundary between life and death.